as India now is. That up until the rise of India, all of the success stories in the developing world had been based around manufactured exports. And that's a good thing, nothing wrong with that. In fact, India needs to do more of that. I'll say more in a sec. But for the first time, we started to see large-scale exports of services from a developing country. That is, if we ask why did that become possible, and the answer is information technology, the internet. That is clearly something that there are just many things that used to be impossible to provide except on a very local basis that can now be outsourced to long distances. So the opportunity arose to start doing that, and it starts with relatively low-tech stuff like call centers, moves on to all kinds of information technology, other services. India got a head start. India began doing that before anybody else. Does it on a scale that nobody else can match. The widespread, again, use of English helps on that. This base of very smart people who understand information technology help on that. I would suspect, by the way, that India has a potential, it's already happening, you have a potential base at the very highest level of people simply coming back from Silicon Valley to do enterprise here. So you have that as well. Now, why is that important? Why is that a special Indian advantage? The kind of hyperglobalization that we have mostly seen so far has involved manufactured goods. And the technologies that enable that, containerization, communication, have probably pretty much been fully exploited. The possibilities of service globalization have only just begun. We're only just in the very earliest stages of finding ways to deliver services remotely. And so there, whatever I may have said about hyperglobalization having been a one-time event, the globalization of service trade is still something that is probably mostly in the future. So India starts from an export mix that happens to be especially well suited to the next stage of globalization. That's a reason to be especially hopeful about Indian prospects. I don't think we're not going to see that happening. There will be a few other places that may be able to take pieces of that. We hope there are. You can see beginnings of something like an Indian-style service export sector in the Philippines, for example, and for some of the same reasons, actually. But India has kind of a first-mover advantage in the globalization of services, and that's an appealing prospect. Now, one thing to say about that is what we do not yet see is whether service exporting can provide employment on the scale that India needs. And when we talk about demography, it's funny, I've been reading a lot about India's demographic position, and everyone agrees on the fact there's going to be a dramatic increase in the working age population in India at the same time that other countries are seeing a big stagnation or decline in working age population. But half of the stories on it say, what a tremendous opportunity for India to become the global economic superpower. The other half of the stories say, what a catastrophe, we'll never find jobs for all those people. We're talking about mass unemployment. And both of those are possible stories. So India needs to find a way to employ this vast population. It cannot, it is a densely populated country. They're not going to be employed in agriculture. So we need to be talking about growth in other sectors. And probably, despite what I've said about the advantages from the service export focus, India needs to get much more into the global manufacturing game as well. And there really doesn't seem to be any good reason why that shouldn't be possible, but it's going to be necessary. India, in a way, having done something which was unprecedented, which is to diversify into service exports, in a way that nobody has done. In a way, India now needs to diversify back into manufacturing as well in order to provide the kind of job growth it needs to make use of all of the people who will be coming available. So that's that is a question. But I still think that the unique nature of India's export boom does put it in a favorable position relative to other emerging markets in the decades ahead. Okay, let's talk about reasons for concern. So one very broad, there's a now widely observed phenomenon. I started by talking about how depressing it was to look at development economics 40 years ago because there were no success stories. And since then, there have been many success stories, China and India being the two most dramatic, but quite a few other success stories. However, there have now been enough success stories that we're starting to get some pictures of the limits of success as well. And there's a now quite well-documented phenomenon called the middle income trap. By the way, it's a great privilege. You should be wildly encouraged that India has reached the point where we can now start to talk about the middle income trap. You have to make a lot of progress before you get to that point. But it turns out that it's quite common for countries to grow quite rapidly up until they reach. It varies, 20%, 50% of the per capita income of the wealthiest countries. And then they kind of stagnate or at least slow down dramatically at that point. They don't seem to be able to close that last gap between themselves and Northwest Europe or the United States. And what's that about? I mean, it's a statistical observation. What's it about? And the answer, as best we can tell, this is somewhat speculative, but we think what we see is that institutional problems, institutional failures that are tolerable when you're still a poor, low-wage country start to become bigger obstacles once you no longer are in that position. Once you can no longer compete simply by being much cheaper as a production location in other places, you start to in a way, the future economic progress requires a quality of institutions that is higher. You need to get better at some things, and that can include a wide variety of things. It can include issues of corruption. You can have a very corrupt economy, which, as long as the corruption doesn't totally prevent business from being done, and it has low wages, it can still grow very rapidly. But at a certain point, let's put you can't become Denmark with Chinese levels of corruption, right? You can't. You have to clean up your act in order to be able to really compete at the highest levels. Government, efficient, effective government, including efficient provision of government services. Again, it doesn't have to be all that great at lower levels of development, but it needs to get much better. Banking. The banking system has to. The banking system doesn't have to be great when companies can largely finance themselves through reinvestment of profits, or when the investment opportunities are so large that even a not very effective banking system can do the job. You need to get a lot better at that in order to be able to close that final hurdle. And so you all know India far better than I do, but it's not hard to see that India needs a lot of institutional progress, needs to go a long way to get up to the kind of performance that one sees in the most advanced countries, and that means that India is potentially susceptible to running into this middle income trap. Okay, see I'm hitting limit here, but let me just say two things that may come as surprises to you in terms of threats. One is artificial intelligence. I mentioned that there's kind of a race between transportation costs and productivity in trade and goods. We're now starting to see in services that there's a little bit of a race between globalization and AI. Suppose that you want to get interpretation of medical data. Tests are performed on somebody in New York. They can be interpreted, well, they could be interpreted by somebody here who's paid a third the wage of the comparable person in the U.S., or they could be interpreted by an expert system. So you can outsource it to India, or you can outsource it to cyberspace. And there is something of an issue here. There's a possibility that some of these service opportunities will be foreclosed by AI. I won't say very much more about that, except to say that something is there's fantastic stuff happening on both fronts, but we don't know. There is some competition there. And finally, let me just say that the advanced countries are a mess. And although emerging markets have been moving forward, the advanced countries are still very troubled economies. We're over the worst of the Great Recession, but not for very much. In the United States, we have recovered, we have full employment, but we have interest rates that are still barely above zero. We have no shock absorbers in our system. So if something goes wrong, we have no good way to respond to it. Europe is still not fully recovered. We're still very, very vulnerable in the advanced countries. This open world trading system that has been so crucial to the progress of developing countries is obviously under threat. Populism is on the rise politically all across the advanced world. In addition to systematic populist backlash, you also just want to include the possibility of just plain irrational policy, lashing out. There's no guarantee, it turns out, that even in the most advanced countries, people who have no idea what they're doing may end up in charge of economic policy. I wonder what country I have in mind. Anyway, but the global system is under some risk, and that poses a threat. But let me just end by saying the story so far of India is wildly, wildly encouraging.